My husband asked me to join him for dinner with a potential business partner from Shanghai. He told me to dress conservatively, smile when spoken to, and let him handle the conversation. What he didn't know was that I had spent the past 2 years quietly teaching myself Mandarin, and what I heard him say that night, in a language he was certain I couldn't understand, didn't just end our marriage. It gave me back everything I had slowly surrendered over 17 years. I should start from the beginning, because none of it makes sense without context. My name is Carol, and I am 62 years old now. What I'm about to tell you happened 23 years ago, when I was 39, living in a 4-bedroom colonial in Westchester County, New York, and doing my best to convince myself that I was happy. I wasn't unhappy, exactly. I just wasn't anything. I had become so thoroughly edited down to fit my husband's preferences that some mornings I would stand in front of the bathroom mirror and genuinely struggle to remember what I had wanted before him. My husband, I'll call him Richard, because that was his name and he no longer deserves my protection, had been a commercial real estate developer when we met. I had been an architectural historian working for a preservation society in Manhattan, cataloging 19th-century buildings and writing grant proposals to save them from demolition. I loved that work with the kind of love that feels physical, the way you feel full after a genuinely good meal. When Richard and I married, I kept the job for 3 years. Then we moved to Westchester for the schools, and the commute became complicated, and Richard suggested I take a break, just temporarily, and I was pregnant with our second child anyway, so the timing made sense. That temporary break lasted 14 years. Richard was not a cruel man, not in the dramatic way people sometimes imagine. He didn't raise his voice or make scenes. What he did was quieter and, in some ways, harder to name. He had a way of making my contributions feel like hobbies. When I mentioned wanting to consult part-time for the Historic Preservation Office in our county, he asked who would manage the household. When I signed up for a lecture series on urban planning at Columbia, he forgot to come home in time for me to leave 3 weeks running until I stopped signing up for things. When I talked about my old work, about buildings I had fought to save, about the research I had done, he would nod with the polite attention of someone waiting for you to finish before changing the subject. I learned to stop talking about it. The shift became more pronounced after his company merged with a larger firm that had significant holdings in China. Suddenly, Richard was traveling to Beijing and Shanghai 4 or 5 times a year. He came home from those trips energized in a way he never was after domestic travel. He started dropping Mandarin words into conversation, casually, in the way people do when they want you to know they know something you don't. He hired a tutor. He practiced on his phone during dinner. Once he told me, without any evident awareness of how it sounded, that business was simply more interesting when conducted internationally, that the scale was different, the stakes were higher, the people were sharper. He said this while I was helping our son with algebra homework at the kitchen table. I don't know exactly when I started studying. It was sometime in the second winter after he began his China work, a February that felt particularly long. I found a Mandarin course online late one night when I couldn't sleep. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself it would help me understand what he talked about when he took calls in the other room. I told myself a lot of things that first month. What actually happened was that the language grabbed me the way architecture had grabbed me 20 years earlier. The tones, the characters, the logic of it, the way meaning assembled itself from radicals, the way context altered everything it was endlessly absorbing. I practiced early in the mornings before anyone was awake. I listened to audio lessons during school pickup. I found a tutor in Flushing, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Huang, who met me at a tea shop every other Thursday and was both patient and exacting in equal measure. I made flashcards and hid them in a drawer in my home office, the way a teenager hides a journal. I didn't tell Richard. This needs explaining, because people always ask. I didn't hide it out of strategy. Not at first. I hid it the same way I had learned to hide every interest that mattered to me out of preemptive self-defense. I already knew what Richard would say. He would ask how much the tutor cost. He would wonder aloud whether I was doing something useful with that time. He would find some gentle, deniable way to make the language feel small, the way he made everything that was mine feel small, and I would feel the familiar deflation, and eventually I would stop. So I didn't tell him. I protected it, the way you protect something you know is fragile. By the end of the second year, I was genuinely fluent in spoken Mandarin. Not flawless, Mrs. Huang would be the first to tell you my fourth tone needed work, but functional, natural, able to follow any conversation at a comfortable pace. I read simplified Chinese with effort and traditional characters not at all, but listening and speaking I had down. I understood television. I understood phone calls. I understood the conversations Richard practiced aloud when he thought I was in another room. Then one evening in October, Richard came home from the office with his jacket still on, which he never did, and announced that a man named Mr. Chen was flying in from Shanghai for a series of meetings that week. Mr. Chen was a senior partner at a development firm that Richard's company had been courting for over a year. Dinner was Thursday. A restaurant in Midtown, a private dining room. He wanted me there. He said it almost exactly the way he said most things that involved me. As a logistical matter, he needed a wife at the table. Mr. Chen was in his 60s, traditional, believed that a man's family reflected his character. It would matter. He handed me the name of the restaurant and said he'd made a reservation for 7:30 and that I should wear something elegant but not flashy, something that looked like old money rather than new, his phrasing exactly. He did not ask if I wanted to come. He did not ask about my week or whether Thursday worked. He did not ask anything about me at all. He just handed me a restaurant name and said, "Wear the black dress, the one with the high neck," and I nodded and said, "Of course," and he went upstairs to change. I stood in the kitchen and let the full weight of it settle over me. My husband was taking me to dinner with a man whose language I spoke, and he had no idea. He was going to perform his fluency in front of me as though I were furniture, and I was going to sit there and listen to everything. I spent the next 4 days preparing. I went back to Mrs. Huang. We practiced business Mandarin formal registers, polite constructions, the specific vocabulary of development and investment and partnership. I wanted to make sure I could follow the conversation at a professional level, not just casual speech. I went home each day and reviewed notes I had taken. I was meticulous in a way I hadn't been meticulous about anything in years. Thursday arrived. I wore the black dress with the high neck. Richard checked himself in the hallway mirror 3 times before we left. The restaurant was on 53rd Street, the kind of place where the lighting is designed to make everyone look like they're worth the meal. The private dining room was wood-paneled, quiet, smelling of cedar and good wine. Mr. Chen was already seated when we arrived. He stood immediately, a compact man in his late 60s with silver hair and a dark suit that had clearly been made for him. He bowed slightly. Richard bowed back. I followed Richard's lead, smiling with exactly the pleasant blankness my husband expected of me. We sat. The first half hour was in English surface pleasantries, compliments on the restaurant, some discussion of the week's meetings. Mr. Chen's English was careful and precise, with a slight formality that I found immediately charming. Then, as the first course arrived, the conversation shifted naturally into Mandarin. Richard made the transition smoothly. I could see the small satisfaction on his face. This was his element. I looked at my soup and said nothing and listened. They talked business for a while. Richard presented projections, used vocabulary I recognized from his evening rehearsals. Mr. Chen asked questions. Careful questions, the kind that tested without appearing to test. Richard answered with the confidence of a man who had never seriously doubted his own competence. Then Mr. Chen glanced at me. A brief, courteous acknowledgement, and asked in Mandarin whether I also worked in the development industry. Richard laughed. It was a friendly laugh, the laugh of a man confident in his domain. He answered for me without pause. He said I was at home. He said I managed the household and the children, and that was more than enough to keep anyone busy. He said it warmly, as though it were a compliment. I kept my face arranged around the soup spoon. Mr. Chen said something polite about the importance of a stable home. Richard agreed expansively. And then he said, still in Mandarin, still absolutely certain, I had no idea that, honestly, Carol had never been particularly ambitious, that she had worked in some kind of historical preservation when they first married but had been happy to give it up, that she wasn't the type who needed professional achievement to feel good about herself, that some women were like that, content with the domestic scale of things, and it worked out well for everyone because it meant he could focus entirely on the business without worrying about competing priorities at home. I drank my water. He kept going. He said that managing a wife with her own career aspirations was genuinely complicated, that he had colleagues whose home lives were constant negotiations, and that he was grateful not to have that problem. He said it casually, companionably, the way men talk when they are among themselves and think no one else is listening. Mr. Chen made a sound that could have been agreement. His face, I noticed, had gone carefully neutral. The courses kept coming. The conversation turned to timelines, to construction permits, to the regulatory environment in New York versus Shanghai. I followed all of it. I ate slowly and kept my expression pleasantly vacant and stored everything. Then, somewhere between the main course and dessert, Mr. Chen mentioned that he had been reading about changes to American inheritance law, asked Richard about estate planning for a man in his position. Richard leaned back slightly. He said he'd been meaning to restructure things, actually, that he had been working with a financial advisor to move certain assets into holding structures that would be more flexible going forward. He mentioned a number of properties I had never heard of, and said they were in LLCs that were purely in his name, that it was cleaner that way, that shared ownership complicated things unnecessarily when you were trying to make quick moves in a competitive market. He mentioned that he'd been redirecting investment income into accounts that sat outside the joint financial structure they kept for household expenses, that Carol had no reason to see those accounts or any interest in them, that she trusted him to manage the financial side of things, and that trust was, frankly, one of the great conveniences of their arrangement. The convenient word. I had become a convenient arrangement. I set down my fork. Quietly. I picked up my water glass. I looked at the wood paneling across the room with the expression of a woman who is thinking pleasantly about nothing at all. He was hiding assets. Not complicated financial strategy. Not aggressive tax planning. He was deliberately structuring our shared wealth into structures I couldn't see, using my disengagement from our finances as cover, counting on my trust as a mechanism to stay invisible. I breathed slowly through my nose. Mr. Chen redirected the conversation. Subtly, the way practiced people redirect. He asked about the architectural character of the Westchester project, what Richard planned to preserve of the existing building. It was, I realized, a deliberate pivot away from territory that had made him uncomfortable. I watched his face as he asked the question. There was something in it, a quality of attention that felt different from the polished courtesy of the previous 2 hours. Dessert arrived. Richard relaxed. He began talking about the next 5 years, about his trajectory, about where he saw the firm. He mentioned a possible move to London, that the company was considering it, that it would mean a significant lifestyle change, but that it was an extraordinary opportunity, that he was genuinely excited. He said he hadn't told Carol yet because it was still preliminary and because she would need time to process the idea that she was not always comfortable with change. He hadn't told me. He was planning a transatlantic relocation, and it had not occurred to him to include me in that consideration. I wondered, for a moment, if I had misunderstood. My Mandarin was good, but not infallible. I replayed the sentences in my mind. I had not misunderstood. Dinner ended. We stood. Mr. Chen shook Richard's hand, bowed, said the appropriate things. Then he turned to me, and something shifted in the quality of his attention. He said in English that it had been a genuine pleasure, that he hoped we would have the opportunity to speak further. And then he paused, just briefly, and said still in English, but with a slight deliberateness that good listeners were rarer than people imagined, and that they were always the most interesting people at a table. I met his eyes for 1 second. His expression gave nothing away, but the comment was not accidental. In the car home, Richard said the evening had gone well. He said Mr. Chen seemed impressed. He said Thursday had probably sealed it. He was in excellent spirits. He reached over at a red light and squeezed my hand and said, I had done well, had looked beautiful, had been exactly what the situation required. I thanked him. That night I lay in the dark beside my sleeping husband and understood, with a clarity that felt physical, that I had been living adjacent to my own life for 17 years, not in it, beside it, maintaining the surface of it, while everything essential about me had been systematically reduced to a list of requirements I met for someone else's convenience. I did not cry. I was past the part of the story where crying happened. The next morning I called my sister. Patricia was 3 years older than me, and had spent the past 12 years as a family law attorney in New Haven. We were close but not confiding close. Not the kind of close I had allowed to happen with anyone in the years of being Richard's wife. Because Richard found Patricia abrasive, and I had learned to make peace with that by maintaining careful distance from her. That distance had been, I now understood, profoundly convenient for him. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything. The dinner, the Mandarin, the properties, the LLCs, the London plan, all of it. I was precise and sequential and almost entirely calm, which I think alarmed her more than if I had been crying. She was quiet for a long moment when I finished. Then she said, Carol, how long have you been sitting on this? Just last night, I said. She said, okay. She said, first I needed to understand that what I had described intentionally, structuring marital assets into solely owned entities without my knowledge or consent, was not aggressive financial planning. It was potentially fraudulent transfer. She said the LLCs he'd mentioned, if structured the way it sounded, would be discoverable in litigation. She said the investment income accounts were almost certainly traceable. She said that 17 years of marriage in New York State meant equitable distribution, and that equitable distribution meant a forensic accountant would eventually see everything, whether Richard wanted that or not. She said I should not confront him yet. I know you want to, she said. But if you confront him now, he moves things. He has time to prepare. You don't. Right now you have the advantage of him not knowing that you know. Use that. I asked her what I should do. She said document everything. She said start that day. Photograph financial records. Forward relevant emails to a private address he didn't know about. Write down dates, conversations, specific figures he'd mentioned at dinner. She said she was going to recommend a forensic accountant in the city who specialized in hidden marital assets. She said she would handle the legal side herself. She said, You learned Mandarin in 2 years without telling him? Yes, I said. She said, Then you are more capable than you've been giving yourself credit for. Do not underestimate that. I spent the following 6 weeks being the most attentive woman in Westchester County. I was home when Richard was home. I cooked good dinners. I asked about his meetings with appropriate wistfulness. I attended a neighbor's charity event and wore the right earrings. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, I was methodical, in a way I had not been methodical since my years cataloging buildings in Manhattan. Richard kept his financial records in a locking file cabinet in his home office. The key was on his key ring, which he left on the hall table every night. I had a copy made one Tuesday afternoon while he was at a site visit. I photographed 6 years of documents over the course of 3 Saturdays when he played golf, uploading everything to a secure drive Patricia had set up. There were 4 LLCs I hadn't known existed. There were accounts at 2 institutions I had never heard of. There were annual returns showing income streams that had never appeared in any financial conversation we had ever had. There were also emails. Richard printed emails sometimes, a habit I'd always found slightly anachronistic, and filed them in folders in a lateral cabinet behind his desk. Most were routine, but there was a folder, unlabeled, tucked behind the project files, that contained correspondence with a woman at his firm. I could tell from the first 3 lines of the first email that the relationship was not professional. I photographed all of it. I filed the folder back exactly where it had been and closed the cabinet and stood in the middle of his office for a moment, looking at the bookshelves and the framed deals on the wall and the careful performance of professional success he had arranged around himself. And I thought, you were planning to leave me with nothing. The affair was, in some ways, the least surprising thing I found. The financial concealment was worse, because it was colder. The affair was at least human. The hidden LLCs were purely calculated. Patricia filed in November. Her firm served the papers to Richard's office on a Wednesday morning at 9:45. Simultaneously, she forwarded our documentation package to the senior partners at his firm, flagging a separate issue he had used company funds as collateral on one of the private LLCs, something the forensic accountant had discovered, and that constituted a significant breach of his partnership agreement. I was at Patricia's kitchen table in New Haven when it happened. We drank coffee. I couldn't taste it. His first call came at 10:15. I let it go to voicemail. His voice on the recording was confused, then alarmed, then something that had not yet decided what it was. I listened to it once. Patricia listened to it twice, documenting it for the case. He called 11 more times that day. I stayed with Patricia for 2 weeks. She had a guest room and a very calm black Labrador named Henry, who sat on the floor next to whoever seemed most in need of sitting next to, and I was grateful for both. The divorce took 14 months. New York contested proceedings take time, and Richard's attorneys fought the asset disclosure with the energy of people being paid by the hour to do so. But the forensic accountant's work was thorough, the LLCs were unwound, the investment accounts were included in the marital estate. The property he had kept solely in his name for convenience was subject to equitable distribution in New York. His firm, conducting its own parallel investigation, negotiated a departure agreement with him that included a reduction of his partnership stake to recover the improperly used collateral. When it was finished, I walked away with the Westchester house, which I immediately sold, half of every asset that had existed at the date of our separation, and support for 4 years while I rebuilt a professional standing. It was not perfect. It was enough. But the thing I hadn't anticipated, the thing that still surprises me when I think about it, happened 3 months into the divorce proceedings. I received an email from Mr. Chen. It was brief and written in English, though with a formality that I suspected was deliberate. He wrote that he had given some thought to our dinner in October and that he found himself thinking, not for the first time, about the question of useful expertise. He wrote that his firm was beginning a long-term project in New York, a mixed-use development on a site in Lower Manhattan that had significant historical complications. The site had been a 19th-century commercial building of some architectural consequence, and the city's landmark commission was involved, and his firm needed someone who understood both the preservation regulatory environment and could serve as an effective liaison with city agencies. He had, he wrote, done some research and found my prior credentials in architectural history unexpectedly relevant. He wondered if I might be willing to speak. I read the email 3 times. Then I called Patricia and read it to her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Carol." He knew. I thought about that dinner, about the way his face had gone careful when Richard spoke, about the comment at the end of the evening, "Good listeners are rarer than people imagine," about the way he had looked at me for that 1 second in the restaurant lobby. He had known, or suspected. He had understood enough of what was happening at that table to feel something that looked very much like discomfort on my behalf, and he had filed me away not as the decorative wife but as a woman who understood every word of what was being said and had chosen, for her own reasons, to say nothing. I replied to his email in Mandarin. His response, also in Mandarin, was warm in a way his English had not been. He wrote that he was glad he had trusted his instinct. He wrote that my language ability had not been the deciding factor, my professional background had been genuinely useful on its own, but that a consultant who could attend meetings with his Shanghai team and follow conversations in real time, without the filter of translation, was a practical asset he had not expected to find. We met for lunch at a restaurant in Midtown, neutral ground, no private dining room. He greeted me in Mandarin. I responded in Mandarin. He laughed. A genuine laugh, possibly the first one I had heard from him. He said he had spent part of the October dinner wondering how long I was going to maintain the performance, whether I would hold it to the end. I said I almost didn't. He asked what had stopped me. I told him that I had learned, over many years, not to react to things immediately. That the first instinct was usually the wrong one when it came to timing. That patience, properly applied, was not the same thing as weakness. He nodded at that with the expression of someone who has thought carefully about the same idea. I took the consulting engagement. The Landmark Commission project was complicated and genuinely interesting, the kind of work I had walked away from when I was 26 and thought I had time to come back to it later. I had not expected to find my way back to it at 39, through a door that had been opened by a dinner I had not been invited to as a person but as a prop. I consulted for Mr. Chen's firm for 9 years before transitioning into an independent practice. I testified in front of the Landmarks Commission. I worked on projects in Brooklyn and the Bronx, and eventually in Philadelphia and Boston. I traveled to Shanghai twice and spoke Mandarin the entire time, and was treated, consistently, as someone whose expertise was the point of her presence. I never remarried. I dated, occasionally. There was a professor of urban planning in Boston I was fond of for 3 years before we parted on genuinely amicable terms. Mostly, I built a life that was mine in every room. I chose my own furniture. I spent Saturday mornings exactly as I wished. I took a photography course. I took 2, actually. Richard remarried within 2 years. I heard about it through mutual acquaintances, in the way you hear things you didn't ask about and don't need. I wished him nothing specific. I'm 62 now and I have been retired for 3 years, which mostly means I consult selectively on projects that interest me and spend the rest of my time doing what I want, which is considerable. I still speak Mandarin. I take a class on Tuesday evenings with a teacher who is half my age and significantly stricter than Mrs. Huang ever was, and I am grateful for that. I think about that dinner sometimes. The wood paneling, the careful lighting, the soup, Richard's voice in the language he thought belonged only to him, saying everything he actually believed about me without the usual performance of consideration. There is something almost clarifying about the moment when the gap between what someone says to your face and what they say behind your back collapses completely. You stop wondering. You stop second-guessing your own perception. You know. I learned Mandarin because I needed something that was mine. Because I had spent so many years in a life organized around someone else's preferences that I had begun to lose track of my own. The language was the first thing in years that I had kept purely for myself, without permission, without apology, without asking whether it was practical or worthwhile or a good use of my time. It was those things, but it was mostly just mine. And then it turned out to be the thing that showed me I had never actually stopped being capable. I had just stopped being allowed to know it. If you're somewhere in a life that has been slowly edited down to what someone else needed you to be, I'm not going to tell you it's easy to find your way back. It isn't. There will be a period of pure disorientation when you stop maintaining the performance, when you have to rebuild from something small and uncertain. But that small, uncertain thing is yours. Start there. Protect it. Let it grow in the quiet before you have to defend it. Learn the language, keep the records, call your sister, and pay attention to the good listeners at the table. They always know more than you think.